Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel Rightside Blonde. I can't believe today marks episode 91 of the George Collection. I started this show back in January of 2022, so I'm coming up on a full 2 years of this show. And I've had a great time digging back into these magazines, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey getting to know George Magazine. So, for today's episode, I wanted to read the editor's letter from the inaugural issue again, this time with a fresh set of eyes, and think about things in terms of today and where we are today, and also compare that to where we were in 1995 when John Kennedy Jr. wrote this letter. So here we go. If, as some historians suggest, Americans renew their passion for politics every 30 years, perhaps this reawakening is due less to changes of heart than to changes in how the elected communicate with the electorate. During the 30s, radio brought FDR's fireside chats into the homes of a nation frightened and worried by the Depression. In 1960, the Nixon-Kennedy debates ushered in the television age of politics. 30 years later, during the 1992 election, the means by which politicians defined themselves changed yet again. During that presidential campaign, candidates supplemented their frenetic tours from city to city with satellite feeds that hooked them into 10 to 15 local markets at a time. When Bill Clinton and Al Gore climbed aboard a bus and rode through towns like Corsicana, Texas, and Parrott, Georgia, places that hadn't seen a presidential candidate since World War II, I watched along with millions of others from across the country as the spectacle was beamed back to us in a microsecond. Empowered by technology and emboldened by a desire to take their case directly to the people, politicians broke all the old rules. Clinton played his sax on Arsenio Hall, George Bush appeared on MTV, and Ross Perot shocked us all by announcing his candidacy on Larry King Live. Over dinner one evening, during the early months of the Clinton administration, my partner, Michael Berman, and I noted that friends who had never turned an eye toward things political were suddenly taking notice of new faces coming to power in Washington. Whether it was because of who they were or how they were covered, these new personalities were proving fascinating to a freshly engaged public. Since that time, the trend has only accelerated. Political figures are increasingly written about as the personalities and pop icons they have become. Politics has migrated into the realm of pop culture, and folks can't turn away. That's not to say the prospects for a successful political magazine were encouraging when Michael and I started developing the idea for George 2 years ago. Despite what we perceived as a surge of interest in the personalities of politics, the public's cynicism toward government itself was as pervasive as ever. A magazine devoted entirely to covering a system widely regarded as broken was a tough sell. But voters nevertheless seemed energized by their anger and eager to experiment with alternatives. And perhaps because we were publishing neophytes, we stuck with the idea even after the instructor in our 2-day seminar called Starting Your Own Magazine told us you can successfully launch a magazine in just about anything except for religion and politics. Fortunately, one company that knows a thing or two about publishing disagreed. After 14 months of dubiously successful fundraising, we brought our idea to the people at Hatchet Philippachi, and from the start, they recognized its viability. Today, they are our partners in this venture. All along the way, the question we never stopped being asked was, why create a magazine about politics? We believe that if we can make politics accessible by covering it in an entertaining and compelling way, popular interest and involvement in the process will follow. But calling George a political magazine isn't entirely accurate, since we aim to be a breed apart from traditional political magazines. Our coverage of politics won't be colored by any partisan perspective, not even mine. George is a lifestyle magazine with politics at its core, illuminating the points where politics converges with business, media, entertainment, fashion, art, and science. Whether it's violence in the movies or free speech on the internet, culture drives politics. The public arena is not a hothouse sealed off from the general climate. It partakes of it, changes it, and is changed by it. Recognizing that interest in inside Washington is thin beyond the Beltway, we will define politics extravagantly, from elected officials to media moguls to movie stars to ordinary citizens, and we will cover it exuberantly, showing the unexpected, meaningful, and whimsical ways that it affects your daily life. The fact that George is post-partisan doesn't mean that we don't have opinions. It just means we don't believe that party affiliation is the only hook on which to hang one's political identity. With a recent poll showing that nearly 40% of all Americans no longer have any loyalty to any organized party, we suspect that Americans want to know more about the people who seek to govern and less about the correctness of their politics. When progressives find themselves defending the status quo and conservatives are advocating wholesale change, labels serve less to define than to obscure. In George, you will hear all the voices in today's political dialogue because, as we learned from last November's midterm elections, today's opposition can become tomorrow's ruling class. We approach politics as you might, as skeptical consumers, for whom efficacy is at least as important as party loyalty. And if we can do one thing at George, we hope it's to demystify the political process, to enable you to see politicians not just as ideological symbols, but as lively and engaging men and women who shape public life. As a lifelong spectator of the giant puppet show that can turn public people into barely recognizable symbols of themselves, I hope we can provide something more useful. We hope you enjoy reading it as much as we've enjoyed creating it. It's the first of its kind, like founding father George Washington, its namesake. We've set out to make a magazine about politics in which the images are as compelling as the prose and where you might find something to feed your enthusiasm, spark your curiosity, or even ease your disaffection. If we're doing it right or slipping off the mark, please let us know. Your input is critical. Our second issue will contain your feedback in our first yays and nays letter to the editor section. We hope you'll be informed, provoked, and entertained. But mainly, we hope you'll get involved because, as a wise man once said, politics is too important to be left to the politicians. I've said that a time or two on this show, but it's a good reminder that that's the mission of George, is to get people involved in the political process. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that John brought up the reawakening of passion for politics every 30 years. Since this issue came out, it's been 28 years. So we're kind of approaching that anniversary again, I think. We're very close to that 30 years. While we're being provoked and entertained by politics, it's important to remember that our involvement is the most important thing, even if the involvement entails just more education so we're better educated when it comes time to vote. And as we approach this 30-year reawakening anniversary of a renewed passion for politics in this country, may we never forget what it took to get here, and may we make this the last reawakening. Let's make this the last reawakening. Let's stay awake. Let's pass this passion down to our children, and let's never forget what we've gone through in the last 30 years. That does it for this episode of the George Collection. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.
George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late-night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process. And while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.